Hello, I'm Emma Griffin. I'm the President of the Royal Historical Society, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome so many of you to tonight's Prothero Lecture. As some of you will know, this occasion marks a real high point in our calendar, a moment when we typically meet at the Society's headquarters at UCL to both enjoy the Prothero Lecture and to recognise and reward the work of some of our colleagues at our annual prize-giving ceremony. This year, for fairly obvious reasons, we are unable to host a party at UCL, but our prize judging has proceeded as normal, and we're looking forward to announcing our winners virtually on the 23rd of July. We are also hoping to organise an especially large party next year, to which we'll invite past prize winners and speakers who have missed out on the Society's hospitality owing to the pandemic. We will, of course, share all the details through our mailing list, and members of the Society are able to join us. We'll be most welcome to. For this evening, then, our focus is the Prothero Lecture. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this event has subtitles, and you're able to switch that function either on or off by clicking on the CC Live Transcript button on the bottom right hand of your screen, according to your preference. Also, if you need to raise any questions during the event, please use the chat function, and a member of the RHS team will be in touch. For questions, we're going to open the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I'd ask you to post your questions to Robert there rather than in the chat. A reminder too that this lecture is being recorded and will be made publicly available through the RHS website in the very near future. Well, our speaker tonight is Robert Frost, who holds the Burnett Fletcher Chair of History at the University of Aberdeen and is a specialist in the history of early modern Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. Robert grew up in Edinburgh and studied modern history at the University of St Andrews, where he developed an interest in Polish history. After a PhD at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies and a teaching post at King's College, both in London, of course, he returned to Scotland in 2004, where he is still based and currently working on a 3-volume history of the Polish-Lithuanian Union for Oxford University Press. He's the author of several books on early modern Poland, the most recent of which, The Making of the Polish-Lithuanian Union, 1385 to 1569, and published in 2015, won the Pro Historia Polo-Norman Prize for the best foreign language book on Polish history, published between 2012 and 2017. Robert was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2016 and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2020. In this evening's lecture, Robert explores the idea of the Renaissance Republic through a comparative study of Poland, Lithuania, and the kingdoms of the British Isles in the later 16th and 17th century. He's given me a few more notes about the lecture, but I honestly think that his words will be of far greater interest to you than mine. So I invite you to sit back and listen to Robert speak on the roads not taken, liberty, sovereignty, and the idea of the Republic in Poland, Lithuania, and the British Isles, 1550 to 1660. Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that generous introduction. It's just a pity that we're not all together in the Royal Historical Society's rooms here in UCL, where I'm speaking from. I'm delighted to be down here again after so many years. It is a strange feeling, having studied history all your adult life, when you realize that you don't understand the history of your own country. I took courses on British and Irish history at St Andrews with Norman Gash and Scottish history with Bruce Lenman, and taught Tudors and Stuarts at A-level for 3 years. But my research career has focused on the Polish-Lithuanian Union. By 2004, when I returned to Scotland, I felt that I had a reasonable understanding of Polish-Lithuanian political culture, and that it might be interesting to investigate the political culture of the British Isles, whose kingdoms formed the other great parliamentary union of the early modern period. I recall the moment when I realized that I understood nothing at all. I was reading the Jus Regium of Sir George Mackenzie of Rose Hall, the great Scottish lawyer of the 17th century, Lord Advocate, opponent of witch trials, persecutor of Covenanters, and founder of the Faculty of Advocates Library, who is celebrated in a memorial window in the National Library of Scotland to this day. I was jerked awake by the following passage. What nations under heaven were so happy as we under the reign of King Charles I? Now, would that be the same King Charles I who managed to start at least one war in each of his 3 kingdoms, who was sold to his English subjects by his Scottish subjects for the knockdown price of £400,000 sterling, and who ended up on the scaffold on account of his magnificent intransigence and refusal to compromise his exalted view of monarchy? Or was Sir George referring to another Charles I, living in one of Stephen Hawking's parallel universes, in which a benign and shrewd monarch governed peacefully and happily with the consent of his parliaments, cropped no ears, and kept his head on his shoulders? What followed was even more perplexing. Whatever proves monarchy to be an excellent government does by the same reason prove absolute monarchy to be the best government. For if monarchy be to be commended because it prevents divisions, then a limited monarchy, which allows the people a share, is not to be commended because it occasions them. I cannot but exceedingly commend our predecessors for making this reasonable choice of an absolute monarchy, for a monarch that is subject to the impetuous caprices of the multitude when giddy, or to the incorrigible factiousness of nobility when interested, is in effect no government at all. I was intrigued by Mackenzie's assertion that his predecessors had chosen absolute monarchy, and by his trenchant attack on the classic Aristotelian and Polybian forma mixta, the mixed form of government, that combined monarchy with aristocracy and popular government, and underpinned the idea of the Renaissance res publica. I had read enough to know that before 1660, most British political theorists, far from endorsing absolute monarchy, spoke a language that I, as a historian of Poland-Lithuania, largely understood. In the British Isles, as in Poland-Lithuania, political theorists read the same classical authors: Aristotle, Polybius, Cicero, Seneca, Sallust, Tacitus, and their ilk, although Tacitus was not as popular on the Vistula as he was on the Thames. They wrestled with the same age-old problems. What is the essence of good government? How can tyranny be prevented? In what circumstances can and should royal authority be resisted? And they drew on the wisdom of the ancients to answer them. The answers given by 16th century writers in the British Isles seem broadly familiar to me. The world of Sir Thomas Smith, of Philip Sidney, who remarked that Poland was a well-balanced aristocracy, or of George Buchanan, to whose de jure regni apud Scotus, Mackenzie's jus regium was a counterblast, did not seem far removed from that of Polish-Lithuanian writers such as Andrzej Frycz-Modrzewski, Andrzej Wolan, or Wawrzyniec-Goślicki, Laurentius Goslicius, whose 1568 treatise De Optime Senatore was translated several times into English. What road led the Scotland that had deposed Mary Stuart in 1567, the Scotland of George Buchanan and the 1638 National Covenant, to Mackenzie's vision of absolutist Arcadia? What road led the England of Coke, Pym, and Hampden, the England that executed its king and abolished monarchy in 1649, from the 1628 Petition of Rights and the 1641 Grand Remonstrance, to the bleak dystopianism of Hobbes's Leviathan, and the 1684 resolution of the Convocation of Oxford University, which welcomed Mackenzie's jus regium and praised its author for the service done to His Majesty? Of course, then, as now, the Convocation of Oxford University did not speak for all of Oxfordshire, let alone all of England, while Mackenzie's views were by no means accepted by all his compatriots. Nevertheless, while Poland-Lithuania had its supporters of strong monarchy, such as Krzysztof Warszawicki or the Jesuit firebrand Piotr Skarga, it chose a very different road in this period. And I believe that I'm safe in claiming that even Poland-Lithuania's most ardent regalists stopped short of expressing sentiments remotely akin to those of Sir George Mackenzie. The question of why the paths of political cultures that drank deeply at the wells of classical and Renaissance political thought should diverge so markedly in the 17th century is a serious, and I hope an interesting one. The cynic might suggest that the reason many Scots in the Convocation of Oxford University were beguiled by Sir George can be encapsulated in two words: Oliver and Cromwell. But the problem, I would suggest, is rather more complex. I hope that considering it comparatively might shed light on current debates in Polish-Lithuanian and British Isles history. Let me begin with a question that is central to what follows. What do we mean when we talk of early modern republicanism? On the banks of the Thames, where I am more or less sitting this evening, this is not an easy question to answer. This difficulty stems, I would suggest, from too little caution in reading back into this period more modern understandings, not just of the term republic, but also of the term state. Here, I believe, the example of Poland-Lithuania helps to complicate the general picture of the idea of the Republic in early modern Europe. For this teleological temptation, as in so much, Machiavelli bears considerable responsibility on account of the famous first sentence of his Prince. All the states and all the dominions under whose authority people have lived in the past and live now have been and are either republics or principalities. Machiavelli's stark binary division between monarchical and republican forms of the state has encouraged scholars to stress a distinction that, I would suggest, took time to embed itself. Nevertheless, Quentin Skinner and Martin van Gelderen argue that whatever else it may have meant to be a republican in early modern Europe, it meant repudiating the age-old belief that monarchy is necessarily the best form of government. And they add that many republicans took it as obvious that a republican constitution should eschew all traces of monarchical authority. That Machiavelli's distinction gained traction in this period is undeniable, encouraged as it was by the 1581 repudiation of Philip II of Spain by the United Provinces and by the Rump Parliament's repudiation of monarchy shortly after Charles's execution. These acts indeed helped cement our modern understanding of republicanism. But as Skinner and van Gelderen admit, there were some who thought differently. Certainly in Poland-Lithuania, the res publica, or Rzeczpospolita as it was known, was not understood to imply any repudiation of monarchy, although most Poles and Lithuanians would have agreed that pure monarchy was not the best form of government. Deep into the 18th century, they remained profoundly attached to the former mixta and saw their republic as its modern incarnation. I use the term republic deliberately, for although commonwealth, the early modern English translation of res publica, is generally applied to the Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodów, the Commonwealth of the Two Nations, as Poland-Lithuania termed itself after 1569, Poles and Lithuanians did not doubt that their polity was a republic, of which the king was an essential component. I use the term polity rather than state, because this is another problem that bedevils study of the impact of civic humanism. Machiavelli's usage of stato, state, indicates that already in the early 16th century, something akin to our understanding of the term state was emerging. By 1600, encouraged by Giovanni Bottero's concept of reason of state, the idea of the abstract state as a juridical construct with a legal personality distinct from the person of its ruler or rulers was becoming increasingly influential and was to become even more so in the age of Richelieu and Hobbes. The Aristotelian polis, however, was conceived as a community of citizens, and to represent it as the same beast as the abstract juridical construct of the state, formed in 16th and 17th century Europe, is, I would suggest, to confuse two rather different animals. Long before 1550, Poles and Lithuanians grasped this fundamental distinction, as is demonstrated by the crucial clause in the 1569 Union of Lublin, that the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania already form one indivisible and uniform body and are not distinct, but compose one common republic, which has been constituted and formed into one people out of two states and two nations. The distinction drawn here between the republic, the polis, the community of citizens, and the two states that formed it, for which the text uses the modern Polish word for state, państwo, was essential to the transformation of the union between the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, first established in 1386, into a stable partnership of legal equals and a union of peoples that forged one republic, conceived as a community of citizens, not subjects of a sovereign monarch. The 1569 Lublin Treaty ended a long argument that dated back to 1386 over the relationship between Lithuania and Poland. Lithuanians rejected the incorporationist Polish interpretation of the union, claiming that the Grand Duchy was an equal partner to the Kingdom of Poland. Civic humanism was crucial to the settling of this squabble. With its vision of a self-governing citizen republic in which communal liberties were protected, it provided the intellectual framework within which Poles and Lithuanians could unite. As the values of civic humanism spread among the Polish and Lithuanian elites after 1500, the road opened up to the triumph of the Lithuanian concept of union in 1569. Thereafter, the two states were legally distinct, with separate governments and armies, but a common parliament, the same, and one monarch, elected jointly by the republic's citizens. Civic humanism also provided the intellectual underpinnings for the constitutional revolution, of which the Lublin Union was the first component. The central vision of civic humanism, of a community of virtuous citizens defending their republic through the mechanisms of the mixed form of government, complemented and completed an older Polish tradition with deep medieval roots. Poland established itself as an independent kingdom in the 11th century, but fell apart in the 12th. It was partly reconstituted by Władysław the Short in 1320, but his son, Casimir III, failed to produce an heir. Casimir agreed to the succession of his nephew, Louis of Anjou, King of Hungary, on his death, but he met resistance in 1370 when, as he lay dying, he sought to carve out a duchy for his legitimized grandson, Kazimierz of Stolp. The rejection of this last fling of patrimonial monarchy established the principle that kings could not alienate any territory of the kingdom without the consent of the community of the realm, the Corona Regni Poloniae, the crown of the Polish kingdom. This distinction between the regnum as a state and the Corona Regni as an Aristotelian polis, a community of citizens, was reflected in the 1413 Horodło Union, in which the word res publica appears. The authority of the community of the realm was entrenched when Louis of Anjou, who failed to produce a male heir, sought to ensure the succession of one of his two daughters to the Polish throne. The price was the 1374 privileges of Koszyce, the first of the great grants of privileges to the Polish szlachta, the nobility. On Louis's death in 1382, however, the community of the Polish realm rejected Mary, the daughter Louis intended to succeed him in Poland, in favor of the 10-year-old Jadwiga, who did not succeed her father formally until she was elected Queen Regnant 2 years later. Elective monarchy was consolidated by the Crevaux Act in August 1385, in which Jogaila, the 44-year-old pagan Grand Duke of Lithuania, agreed to convert to Catholicism as the price of his marriage to Jadwiga and his election to the Polish throne, which followed in February 1386, initiating the Polish-Lithuanian Union. The elective principle was crucial for the protection of the expanding liberties of the Polish szlachta. Władysław Jagiełło, as Jogaila is known in Poland, fought to establish his hereditary right to the Polish throne in 1399 on Jadwiga's death, and in the 1420s when, to everyone's surprise, he produced two male heirs in his mid-70s with his fourth wife. He secured a promise that one of them would be elected to succeed him at the price of agreeing the 1433 privileges of Jedlnia. After 1386, Polish liberties were gradually extended to Lithuanian and Ruthenian nobles. Crucially, the elective principle was granted to the Grand Duchy in 1413. Jagiełło had installed his cousin Vytautas as Grand Duke in 1401 to govern Lithuania on his behalf, retaining the hereditary title of Supreme Duke. The 1413 Horodło Union granted the Lithuanians the right to elect a successor to Vytautas. Other privileges followed, notably at Nieszawa in 1454, which laid the foundations of the Polish parliamentary system by establishing that the king could not call out the noble levy without the consent of the local sejmiks, the dietines. The establishment of the rights of the sejmiks thus predated the definitive establishment of the Sejm, the central diet, which emerged as a bicameral body between the 1460s and the 1490s, whose powers were definitively established in 1505 with the Statute of Nihil Novi, which decreed that no new laws could be enacted without Sejm consent. This system embodied the Roman law principle of quod omnes tangit ab omnibus tractare et approbare debet. That which touches all should be discussed and approved by all. The Polish institutions embodying this principle, the sejmiks and the locally elected courts, were extended to Lithuania by the Second Lithuanian Statute in 1566. From the 1530s, statutes were printed in Polish, enabling politically active citizens to acquire what was often a deep knowledge of the law. Renaissance republicanism fitted this tradition well and inspired the constitutional revolution initiated by the Lublin Union and completed after the death of Sigismund August, the last of the Jagiellon dynasty in the male line, on 7th of July 1572. Many historians have presented the two interregna that followed in a negative light. It took 19 months to elect and crown Henry of Valois, and his escape back to France in June 1574, 4 months after his coronation, is often taken to indicate the impossibility of governing Poland-Lithuania. Henry's successor, Stefan Batory, was only elected after a largely senatorial faction had declared Emperor Maximilian II king. The Lithuanians did not participate, and Batory was crowned nearly 2 years after Henry's flight, despite furious Lithuanian protests at this breach of Lublin. The 1587 election sparked a brief civil war before Sigismund III Vasa was confirmed as king. In 1592, when Sigismund succeeded to the Swedish throne, it seemed as if he too was intending to flee and cede his throne to the Habsburgs. Sigismund did stay after the humiliating 1592 Inquisition Sejm, at which his conduct was robustly criticized. In 1606, his modest reform proposals provoked a full-blown revolt, a rokosz as it was known. This was a rebellion undertaken in defense of the law, which claimed to be constitutional. At its height, on 24th of June 1607, in a camp at Jeziorna, Sigismund's deposition was declared, following the invocation of the principle of de non prestanda obedientia, the formal right to withdraw obedience from a monarch who had broken his coronation oath, which had been included in the Henrician articles prepared for Henry of Valois and sworn to by Batory and all subsequent monarchs at their coronations. Hindsight, as Mackenzie's rosy view of the reign of Charles I demonstrates, can be profoundly distorting. What is impressive about the 4 years between 1572 and 1576, during which the Union had a monarch for a mere 4 months, is the integrative force of the Republican idea and the capacity of the Republic's institutions to cope with the absence of a king. There was no descent into anarchy. In a religiously divided age, during which France experienced 8 civil wars over 3 decades, the Republic reached agreement remarkably quickly over how to manage the election and then how to deal with Henry's flight. In 1572-3, despite no precedents and considerable opposition from some quarters, it was agreed that the Catholic primate, the Archbishop of Gniezno, should act as interrex. A convocation Sejm, summoned to establish the form of the election, which some thought was illegal, took the momentous decision to institute the principle that kings should be elected viritin, with every citizen having the right to participate. Some 40,000 did so in 1573. Despite concern that the law was silent in the absence of a king, local Sejmiks established special courts to judge the most urgent criminal cases. After Henry scarpered, he was given a deadline for his return. When he failed to appear, he was deposed with little fuss. This framework embodied the mixed form of government. In the bicameral Sejm, the Chamber of Envoys, elected by the Sejmiks, represented the popular element of the Aristotelian constitution. Its members, envoys not representatives, conveyed the wishes of the populace, as expressed in the Sejmiks, and set down in the instructions with which they were furnished. These provided the basis for negotiation to reach the consensus necessary to agree legislation under the principle of unanimity, which regulated Sejm decisions, the principle that was steadily debased after 1660, but which, down to 1648, functioned tolerably enough. The upper chamber, the Senate, comprising Catholic bishops, government ministers, and the most important provincial office holders, doubled as a Senate council, whose dual function involved giving counsel to the king while acting as guardians of the king and the law, custodes regis ac legis, to ensure that the monarch, in governing, did not breach the laws that constrained his actions, according to the Thomist principle of lex est rex, the law is king. Attachment to this system was profound. Poles and Lithuanians were confident that the bonum commune, the common good, would be protected so long as its principles were upheld by virtuous citizens. This vision of Renaissance republicanism was taken to be fully in accord with constitutional tradition, the ancient constitution, to use a contemporary English term. The king was a constitutive part of the republic, but the republic could, if necessary, function without him. There was no need for the mystic malarkey of the king's two bodies. As Piotr Zborowski, Palatine of Sandomierz, put it, when conveying the news of Sigismund August's death to the Sandomierz Szlachta, it was no novelty for our ancestors that kings die and must die. They understood that their republic was and must be eternal. From the interregnum following the death of Louis of Anjou in 1382, the Szlachta had developed the institution of Confederation, in which citizens bonded formally together and swore oaths to provide a legal basis for their political actions. The summoning of Seims and Sejmiks was formally the prerogative of the king, but in the absence of a king, Sejmiks confederated themselves to ensure that their decisions had a legal basis. As was stated by the Vishnya Sejmik of the Ruthenian Palatinate in 1572, although the king dies, authority does not perish. Thus was the principle of Renaissance self-government institutionalized. Civic humanism in the British Isles travelled down different roads. J.G.A. Pocock claims, indeed, that it had minimal influence in England until June 1642, when Charles I's reply to the 19 propositions presented by the Long Parliament constituted, according to Pocock, one of the keys that opened the door to Machiavellian analysis. Charles, on the advice of two moderate royalists, Viscount Falkland and Sir John Culpeper, presented the English political system in terms of the classic forma mixta, in a gambit that Pocock considered to be constitutionally incorrect and a disastrous tactical error. Hitherto, Pocock argued, English interest in civic humanism was limited to the idea of the humanist as counsellor to his prince. He concluded that the community of counsel does not become a republic in the acephalous sense. It remains a corpus of which the prince is head, a hierarchy of degree in which counsel is given by every man sitting in his place. If Pocock is right, then in England, in contrast to Poland-Lithuania, civic humanism was impossible to accommodate within the ancient constitution, the medieval tradition of limited monarchy that was appealed to in the 19 propositions, a tradition founded on Magna Carta, the common law, and Sir John Fortescue's notion of dominium politicum ac regale, which drew on medieval ideas of lordship rather than humanism. Why should this be so? Was it also the case in Scotland, where, as Roger Mason observes, George Buchanan, the great Scottish humanist and advocate of limited monarchy, showed little interest in the forma mixta, despite his belief that civic virtue was the key to political life? In considering this problem, I would suggest we need to guard against privileging texts and opinions that seem to us to reflect a more modern mode of thinking over older patterns of thought. The desire of scholars for precision of thought can often hinder an appreciation of the messy reality of what the analysts termed collective mentalité, collective mentalities. Lucien Febvre warns us about our overriding need for logic, coherence, and unity, this or that, not this and that at the same time. It seems to me that in confronting the question I have put before you today, we need to restrain our scholarly desire for conceptual precision. Thinkers and politicians in such a turbulent age were not necessarily entirely coherent, as they struggled to reconcile the political traditions and modes of thought inherited from their medieval forebears with the more recent principles of civic humanism, whether imbibed directly from Aristotle, Livy, and Cicero, or mediated through Machiavelli, Guicciardini, or Botero. Pocock's characteristically trenchant contention has been challenged. Markku Peltonen has provided us with much evidence of the reception of civic humanism in the England of Elizabeth and James I, although he is sufficiently influenced by Pocock to suggest that what he calls classical republicanism had a limited but undoubted impact on English political thought, and agrees with Blair Warden and Kevin Sharp that an unmixed republic was hardly a practical option in England before the Civil War. Peltonen does not, however, define what he means by classical republicanism and does not consider whether a mixed republic might have been a practical option, despite suggesting in the context of the vexed question of the succession to the childless Elizabeth as she aged, that a dominant section of the political nation could conceive of England under highly exceptional circumstances as a Polish-style republic or as a mixed polity, although he almost immediately retreats from this position, observing that it is perhaps even more astonishing to find that the English displayed a particular reticence about the mixed constitution, and had very little relevant to say about it, before again qualifying his position by stating that there was a greater interest in the mixed constitution under James I, without asking why that might be. Peltonen finds this lack of appreciation for the former mixture astonishing. He is, however, I would suggest, struggling with a definition of republicanism based on the Machiavellian distinction between different forms of the state, and the modern definition, derived from Machiavelli, of a republic as a system without a king, which forces him to conclude, as the title of his second chapter indicates, that classical republicanism existed only in the margins of Elizabethan politics. This struggle is also evident in the influential challenge mounted by Pat Collinson to Pocock, on which Peltonen draws extensively, with his concept of the English monarchical republic. Collinson's critique centres on Pocock's blunt assertions that in no way was Tudor England a polis or its inhabitants citizens, and that the concept of a republic of equal citizens was, and I quote, something not to be found in England as yet scarcely to be imagined there. Collinson challenged Pocock on two fronts. He claimed, firstly, that the idea of the polis had considerable appeal at the local level, especially in the towns and cities of Tudor and Jacobean England, a suggestion warmly endorsed by historians of urban culture and local government, such as Steve Hindle and my former colleague in Aberdeen, Phil Withington. Secondly, Collinson pointed out that in 1586, Sir William Cecil confronted the succession problem by drafting a parliamentary bill authorising temporary government by a great council in the event of Elizabeth's death and establishing arrangements for designating or choosing a successor. In January 1585, indeed, Cecil sounded rather Polish when he declared that the government of the realm shall continue in all respects in the event of Elizabeth's death. But this came to nothing. As Paulina Hughes has shown, calls for the exclusion of Mary Stuart from the succession and consideration of the possibility of Parliament electing a successor to Elizabeth were more widespread than was traditionally recognised, despite censorship and Elizabeth's willingness to use the law to suppress them. Andrew Hadfield has argued that Shakespeare's plays, written as Elizabeth aged, emerged out of a culture that was saturated with Republican images and arguments, even if he follows Collinson and Peltonen by suggesting that these were never clearly defined or properly articulated. Nevertheless, Hadfield argues that republicanism was one of the key problems that defined Shakespeare's working career. I have not the time today, nor indeed the expertise, to enter the lists in this entertaining English joust. From the outside, it seems to me self-evident that classic civic humanism, including the former mixture, had a considerable influence across the British Isles. Writers from a variety of political and religious positions invoked the concept, including John Aylmer, John Ponnet, the Puritan Thomas Cartwright, and the Jesuit Robert Parsons. Aylmer presented England as a classic example of the former mixture, while Sir Thomas Smith, who devotes chapter 6 of his De Republica Anglorum to it, concludes that so seldom or never shall you find commonwealths or government which is absolutely and sincerely made of any of the plebeian forms of government, which he refers to frequently, arguing that commonwealths are always mixed with one another and hath the name of that which is more and overruleth the other always or for the most part. That qualification is significant, and I shall return to it. Despite this evidence for the influence of civic humanism, Collinson and those influenced by him are peculiarly tentative, essentially because they implicitly accept Pocock's definition of republicanism. Collinson presents his monarchical republic as a paradox. Elizabethan England was a republic that happened to be a monarchy, or vice versa, and is almost apologetic about advancing it. There is talk of republican elements in the English system of government, and terms such as quasi or semi-republican abound in the literature. Yet if we adopt Machiavelli's distinction, such formulations verge on the nonsensical. It was an either-or matter. But did contemporary English thinkers think in this way? Collinson talks of citizens concealed within subjects, as if in claiming to be citizens, Elizabethans had to be secretive, and implies that the categories of citizen and subject were, or are, incompatible. He also invokes an anti-monarchical virus that he sees as part of the legacy of 16th century humanism, a revealing formulation, I think. Here we see the yearning for the either-or precision criticized by Febvre. If we consider the Polish-Lithuanian Republic, the problem disappears. For Poland-Lithuania was not a modern republic. It was a Renaissance republic. And a Renaissance republican saw no paradox in a republic that possessed a monarch. Indeed, the monarchical element was essential to a well-balanced mixed republican system, as Machiavelli himself argued in his Discorsi. Dorota Pietrzyk-Reeves, in her splendid account of 16th century Polish republican discourse, which has just been translated, uses the term republican tradition for this discourse to distinguish it from republicanism in the acephalous Procopian sense. Here, since I'm considering both the republican discourse and its embodiment in Poland-Lithuania, I prefer Renaissance republicanism. In Poland-Lithuania, the king was an official of the republic, as Stanisław Zaborowski argued as early as 1507. The king's functions were to govern, to appoint to office, and above all to execute the law. There was considerable support among the ordinary Szlachta for a monarchy with substantial powers to be used to uphold the law and protect the populace, the lesser nobility, from oppression by wealthy magnates who had traditionally dominated politics. From the 1530s, the Polish execution movement urged the monarchy to execute the 1504 statute, outlawing the alienation of royal land, which had benefited powerful magnates. The movement reached its height in the 1560s when considerable amounts of alienated land were recovered for the royal treasury. For Poles and Lithuanians, the polis and the state were distinct conceptual entities, and we should therefore not assume that the terms Rzeczpospolita and state can be used interchangeably, as they frequently are by historians of Poland-Lithuania. Polish and Lithuanian nobles saw themselves both as citizens of a common republic and as subjects of their elected monarch, the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania, respectively. There was no conflict, and citizens were not concealed in subjects. They did not need to be. As members of a mixed polis, they collectively determined the limitations placed upon royal power and, through the Senate Council, regulated its exercise. I would suggest that before 1642, it was perfectly possible for the political elites of the British Isles to think, up to a point, in similar terms. Civic humanism did not suddenly arrive as Falkland and Culpeper scrabbled around to produce a defense against the 19 propositions. The Falkland and Culpeper clearly saw the appeal to the former mixture as a tactically useful response to the Long Parliament, shows that it was well known and potentially effective, whatever Pocock asserts. Portraying the monarchy as an integral part of a well-balanced commonwealth involved no paradox. Yet I would nevertheless agree with Pocock and Warden that the 1640s proved transformative. But Charles's response to the 19 propositions represented, I would suggest, a last hurrah rather than a new beginning for Renaissance republicanism in England. There had always been problems reconciling the mixed form of government with the various political traditions of the British Isles. To understand why, it is necessary to return to Poland-Lithuania, where the social political context was more favorable. The Polish-Lithuanian Szlachta was very different to the landed elites of the British Isles. Thanks to the systems of partable inheritance enshrined in customary law, the Szlachta was not just a privileged class, it was a numerous one. All children of nobles were noble by birth, which is why the frequent translation of Szlachta as gentry is misguided. An English squire might well be a gentleman, but he was a commoner at law. A Polish szlachcic was not, however poor he might be. And many were poor. Perhaps 6 to 8% of the population were noble, nearly 1 million by the late 18th century, with concentrations of poorer nobles in certain provinces, such as Samogitia in Lithuania and Mazovia in Poland. In the latter, nearly a quarter of the population claimed noble status. The political implications were considerable. Poland and Lithuania never developed the hierarchical relationships of mutual obligation seen across Western Europe in the medieval period, although many poorer nobles, especially in the eastern lands, became economically dependent on magnates. The constant division and subdivision of the family property over the generations, however, meant that families or individual branches of families could decline rapidly in status and wealth. This harsh reality had 2 major consequences, which help explain the appeal of Renaissance republicanism. Firstly, partable inheritance fostered Szlachta egalitarianism. There were no titles of nobility to provide a hierarchy of status. The law indeed banned them. The principle was enshrined in the Union of Lublin, which limited use of the title of prince, książę or kniaz, to descendants of the royal dynasties of Lithuania and Rus, the Gediminids and the Rurikids. Sustained by the numerous middling nobles who formed the crucial office-holding class at local level, and from among whom envoys to the Sejm were elected, the principle of noble equality was tenaciously defended. Status was provided by office holding. The power to appoint the major offices of state and provincial office was a royal prerogative, which meant that the king determined the composition of the Senate and his council, the aristocratic part of the constitution. The monarchy therefore retained considerable influence. Thus the ideals of civic humanism, which stressed the service of virtuous citizens to the republic and proclaimed the equality of citizens, confirmed and strengthened principles already embedded in the Polish system and proved attractive to nobles in Lithuania, where magnate power was greater than in Poland. In England and Scotland, primogeniture and entail established a very different system for the inheritance of property and status among the landed elites, and limited the appeal of an egalitarian model of citizenship. It was much harder to enter the House of Lords in England than it was to become a senator in Poland-Lithuania, where monarchs consistently sought to check the power of wealthy magnates by appointing ambitious new men from families without a previous history of senatorial status, who constituted 1/3 and more of appointments. Thus, Pocock is probably right to stress the obstinate adherence to the vision of England as a hierarchy of degree as an important factor that reduced civic humanism's appeal. While office provided a hierarchy of status in Poland-Lithuania, and wealthy magnates did lord it over poorer nobles, attachment to the principle of equality remained strong, encapsulated by the popular proverb, which asserted that a simple nobleman on his manor was the equivalent of a palatine, a vojevoda, szlachcic na zagrodzie, równy wojewodzie. It was no empty phrase. There was another problem. I again agree with Pocock when he speaks of England's highly wrought theory of kingship and authority. If there is one word that encapsulates the difference between the debates in England and Poland-Lithuania, it is sovereignty. Historians of Poland-Lithuania, seduced by the Machiavellian notion that the republic is simply a form of the state, have long debated where sovereignty lay in Poland-Lithuania's mixed form of government, but this is to miss the point. There was no need to talk of sovereignty in a system predicated on the notion of balance between the three forms of government. There were, it is true, some opponents of the king who claimed that supreme authority lay with the populace, such as one pamphlet published in 1607 during the Sandomierz Rokosz. The third estate, the Szlachta, which enjoys a prerogative and preeminence in this republic, is the leading estate. In accordance with this privilege, supreme authority in this kingdom lies with it, for as this privilege states, the nobility is the most powerful part of the kingdom. Yet such assertions are relatively rare, and the immediate qualification of the claim that supreme authority lay with the wider Szlachta by the statement that it formed the most powerful part of the kingdom indicates that sovereignty was not seen as indivisible. Baudin's assertion that it was, and that sovereignty should lie with the king, was highly unpopular in Poland-Lithuania. Baudin's loathing for the forma mixta owed much to his knowledge of the Polish system, as relayed to him by Jan Zamoyski, a member of the embassy that arrived in France to inform Henry of Valois of his election in 1573. Baudin's frequent sour references to Poland-Lithuania meant that he did not top the bestseller lists on the Vistula. Although discontented magnates like Mikołaj Zebrzydowski, Palatine of Krakow in 1606, or Polish Grand Marshal Jerzy Sebastian Lubomirski in 1665, could raise the spectre of absolute monarchy and appeal to the principle of de non prestanda obedientia, it proved impossible in practice to secure enough support to depose the king. Radical firebrands declared Sigismund III deposed in June 1607, but it was easier to claim that the citizen body had a right to depose the king than it was to agree on its implementation. There was minimal support for dethronement. Only 400 signed a document of deposition, compared with over 10,000 who had signed the Articles of Confederation a year earlier. The Sejmiks overwhelmingly preferred to reach accommodation through the Sejm. Sigismund III won the only battle fought during this short civil war, and although his reform proposals failed, he secured Sejm agreement in 1609 that obedience could only be withdrawn at a Sejm, under the primate's authority. That rendered deposition even less likely, since bishops were predominantly regalist in sentiment. In England, however, the idea of the imperial sovereign monarchy proved a fundamental obstacle to the integration of the formal mixta into the ancient constitution, especially after the Henrician Reformation, which installed the monarch as head of the Anglican Church. The tension is evident in Smith's De Republica Anglorum. Although the abstract term sovereignty does not appear, the term sovereign certainly does. Richard Knowles's translation of Baudin did not appear until 1606, but already Smith echoes Baudin in his very first chapter. To rule is understood to have the highest and supreme authority of commandment. That part or member of the Commonwealth is said to rule, which doth control, correct, and direct all other members of the Commonwealth. This is not a mixed system at all, the Smith makes clear. I do not understand that our nation hath used any other general authority in this realm, neither aristocratical nor democratical, but only the royal and kingly majesty. What then of Scotland, which might seem to provide more fertile ground for Renaissance republicanism? North of the border, the Reformation was institutionalized from below, not above, and Presbyterian ecclesiology mirrored the institutions of the secular republic. In Buchanan, Scotland had a sophisticated, well-connected and influential European intellectual who was convinced that legitimacy was conferred on monarchs through election. Unless we have a king chosen by suffrages, I'm afraid we shall have no lawful king at all. He sought to demonstrate the elective and contractual nature of Scottish kingship by enumerating the many kings of Scots who had been deposed, assassinated, or killed in battles by their own subjects. Far from limiting the right of resistance to inferior magistrates, as Calvinist resistance theorists proposed, Buchanan endorsed the assassination of a tyrant by any citizen. Buchanan's contention that kingship was elective was taken up by others. In 1639, Alexander Henderson declared that the people maketh the king, but the king maketh not the people. While in 1644, another prominent Covenanter, Samuel Rutherford, invoked the former mixture in claiming that royalists cannot deny that a people ruled by aristocratic magistrates may elect a king, and a king so elected is formally made a lawful king by the people's election. Rutherford believed that the covenant between the king and the people entered into at the time of his election was conditional, and that the people could withdraw their allegiance if the king upheld false religion. These arguments sound very familiar to a historian of Poland-Lithuania. They reflected a long Scottish political tradition. As in Poland, Scots had asserted in the 1320 Declaration of Arbroath that the king had no right to alienate the kingdom or any part of it without the consent of the community of the realm. And Scots were prepared to defy their king. The National Covenant, drafted in Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh in February 1638 and sent round to parishes to garner tens of thousands of signatures, was the foundation document of what is termed the Scottish Revolution. It appealed to the covenant between God and his people, citing a long list of acts of the Scottish Parliament establishing the true Kirk of God in Charles's northern realm. It explicitly referred to the oath he had sworn at his 1633 coronation to uphold that religion. To a historian used to the robust exchanges of Polish-Lithuanian politics, however, the covenant is a peculiarly half-hearted document. There is no explicit warning to Charles of the consequences of breaking his oath, and no claim of any right to withdraw obedience. Indeed, the signatories solemnly promised that we shall, to the utmost of our power, with our means and lives, stand to the defence of our dread sovereign, the King's Majesty, his person and authority, in the defence and preservation of the aforesaid true religion. That word sovereign again. In reading Buchanan, one can sense a Scot looking down the road travelled by Poles and Lithuanians as far as he could. And another former colleague in Aberdeen, Alan McInnes, stressed the growth of federative senses of Commonwealth in a Scotland struggling to adjust to absentee monarchy after 1603, and drawn attention to the parallels between the institutions of covenanting and the practice of confederation in Poland-Lithuania. Covenanters claimed that they were not seeking to impose government on Scotland, but were seeking to restore Scotland's ancient mixed constitution. And yet the text of the National Covenant and the writings of prominent Covenanters, including Archibald Johnson of Warriston and Alexander Henderson, who drafted it, drew on religious, not secular principles to justify resistance to Charles. In contrast, the most remarkable feature of the constitutional revolution in Poland-Lithuania was its entirely secular nature. It took place against a background of intense religious division between Catholics and Orthodox, a division that long predated the Reformation, between Catholics and Protestants. By 1569, around half the Senate were non-Catholics, most of them Protestant, predominantly Calvinist. Yet religion intruded remarkably little upon the constitutional revolution. The 1573 Warsaw Confederation stipulated that those that differed in religion, dissidentes in religione, would not perpetrate violence or bring legal cases against each other on religious grounds. Protestants accepted the Catholic primate as interrex, and while Catholic bishops were only too happy to cause trouble, the strongly secular basis of civic humanism and the forma mixta united citizens who differed in religion around the secular concept of the Republic. Only in Poland-Lithuania was it conceivable that a confirmed anti-Trinitarian, Mikołaj Sienicki, could be elected on 10 occasions as Speaker of the Chamber of Envoys, which was far more Catholic than the Senate. The National Covenant defined the nation's political and historic identity in a religious and monarchic framework, with little or no reference to the ideals of citizenship propounded by civic humanists. Laura Stewart suggests that, despite Buchanan, the language of citizenship was not commonplace in early modern Scotland, even in the boroughs. She observes that traditional vertical ties of lordship meant that Collinson's monarchical republic was not easy to translate into practice north of the border. In political terms, this has much to do with the fact that since Buchanan had published his great works, the Union of Crowns had transformed the context for Scottish politics. Charles's religious policy may have alienated a majority of his Scottish subjects, but as the text of the Covenant reveals, monarchy was central to the Scottish sense of identity. James VI's succession to the English throne had ended the need for the long, stubborn Scottish resistance to the claims of lordship advanced by English kings, but it provided no constitutional framework in which Scots could assert the equality of the Kingdom of Scotland within the Union, as Lublin provided for Lithuania. Claims for the antiquity of the Scottish monarchy advanced by Hector Boyce, first principal of my university, and Buchanan himself, therefore became central to attempts by Scots to assert their status within the Union. The superior antiquity of their monarchy was the one area, apart of course from their superior understanding of God's word, in which Scots could demonstrate their manifest superiority to their English neighbours. After 1603, Buchanan's vision of elective kingship gradually lost its appeal. Sir Thomas Craig of Riccarton, an advocate of union, asserted that God preferred hereditary monarchy. As everyone knows, he wrote, the will of the people can no more call a prince to the throne than it can eject him from it. Thus, Renaissance republicanism did not gain sufficient purchase in Scotland to underpin a secular revolution. The confederative institutions established to defy Charles I embodied the principles of self-government, but they were justified in religious, not secular terms. They were confessional confederations, as McInnes observes, and the centrality of monarchy to Scottish identity was encapsulated in the Scottish refusal to have anything to do with Charles's trial and the rapid declaration of Charles II's succession following his father's execution. The incorporation of Scotland into the English Republic by Cromwell without so much as a by your leave ensured that when the Restoration came, support for monarchy in Scotland was all but universal, as Claire Jackson points out. So I no longer find the views of Sir George Mackenzie quite so surprising. Long before 1684, the attractions of civic humanism in Scotland had faded. Ireland's colonial situation and its deep religious divisions rendered civic humanism of mere academic interest, I would suggest. Here, the instrument of confederation was used in the 1640s, not to defy, but to support a monarchy that seemed to provide the only hope of protection for native and Old English Catholics, for whom the ideal of virtuous citizenship seemed distant indeed in a system in which the subordination of a Protestant-dominated Irish Parliament to the English Parliament rendered the former mixture largely irrelevant. Even in England, where Charles's execution abruptly removed the monarchical element of the constitution, civic humanism could offer little to a polity in which the army had reduced Parliament to an impotent rump. Yet older modes of thought persisted. After all, Cromwell was offered the throne. He refused, although as Lord Protector he effectively restored the monarchical element in the constitution, which his son was to inherit on his death, since nobody could think of what else to do. It seems that a republic without a king was rather harder to imagine in England than is sometimes suggested. The contrast with 1572 in Poland-Lithuania is striking. After 1566, both states of the Union possessed a political framework in which the ideals of Renaissance republicanism could be realized. In this process, Sigismund August, the last Jagiellon, played a central role. Early in his reign, he had, like his predecessors, largely ruled through his ministers and Senate council. His lack of an heir, however, led him to fret about the continuation of the Union after his death. In 1564, he took the remarkable step of resigning his hereditary rights as Supreme Duke of Lithuania in favor of the community of the Polish realm, the citizen body, much to the chagrin of his three sisters, opening the way to a fully elective monarchy. Finally, in the testament prepared shortly before his death, he endorsed the Republican vision laid out in the Lublin Union in the language of civic humanism. I beseech, remind and urge all ecclesiastical and lay senators, the equestrian order, all nobles and towns, being inhabitants whether of the Kingdom of Poland or of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, that they should maintain their unity in one eternal indivisible body, forming one people, one nation, one unitary republic, as constituted and formed by oath 2 years ago at the Lublin Assembly, and that they should continue in sincere and true fraternal affection, just as if their heads and limbs formed one people, one republic. A Republican king. There are more things in heaven and earth, Professor Pocock, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. There was one more major barrier, finally, to the former mixture in the British Isles. To understand what it was, we need to consider another aspect of the Polish-Lithuanian constitution. The former mixture worked in Poland-Lithuania on account of a feature of the system that attracted considerable criticism from contemporary commentators, the fact that the popular and aristocratic elements of the constitution were drawn from the same social class. From 1572, the major cities effectively withdrew from the system. They were content to form their own self-governing republics on the basis of German law, mainly Magdeburg law, which was extended to royal boroughs and private towns alike. In the Szlachta Republic, therefore, the populace, the popular element in the polity, did not pose any wider social challenge. Debates raged about where the balance between the three elements of the system should lie. But even if many among the Szlachta felt that their preponderance lay with the populace, that constituted no threat to the social order. Not so in the British Isles. Historians are often eager to detect support for popular sovereignty in the political thought of the age. It is not hard to find statements that authority ultimately, or at least originally, lay with the community of the realm. Nevertheless, while political philosophers could talk in general terms of ancient contracts, fundamental laws, and the bestowal of authority on monarchs by the people, their earnest treatises were based on speculation and the sort of mythical history peddled by Boyce and Buchanan in Scotland, or Geoffrey of Monmouth and Ralph Holinshed in England. There were no documents corroborating their speculations. England might have its Magna Carta and Scotland its Declaration of Arbroath, but there was nothing to match the detailed Republican constitutional documents that regulated political life in Poland-Lithuania and specified the nature of the contract with the monarch. In the British Isles, the 1640s demonstrated that ordinary people from almost all social classes were eminently capable of political agency. In both Scotland and England, there was, as Laura Stewart notes, a sudden expansion of the public as a regular descriptor for an organized and coherent body politic, a community encompassing the whole nation. Nevertheless, while political rhetoric frequently invoked such a community, the political activism of the lower orders, once unleashed, proved unsettling. The Edinburgh crowds who turned out in raucous numbers during the prayer book controversy were one thing, levellers, diggers and army radicals in England quite another. In Ireland, a broad conceptualisation of the body politic was impossible for the governing elite in a country in which Catholics comprised a large majority of the people. The spectre of popular radicalism stalked the land. For many among the elites of the British Isles, the impetuous caprices of the multitude when giddy, in Mackenzie's words, proved unsettling indeed. In conclusion, therefore, neither England, nor Scotland, nor Ireland possessed the institutional or social structure that might have made the former mixture more than a scholarly chimera. The execution of Charles I was cathartic. In the British Isles, thinkers and politicians had long struggled to reconcile the ideal of the Aristotelian polis with traditions of imperial monarchy, now bolstered by the Aberdeen concept of indivisible sovereignty. The former mixture, which was suited to the Aristotelian polis, the community of citizens, but not to the juridical abstract state, was no longer fit for purpose, although the fact that Algernon and Sidney was still appealing to it in the 1690s suggested that we should be properly cautious of reports of its demise. After 1560, different means of controlling the dread sovereign monarch needed to be found. Ultimately, the peculiarly British fiction of the indivisible sovereignty of the king in Parliament was devised to solve the problems posed by Charles II and his Catholic brother, which neatly kept Mackenzie's absolutism at bay, while avoiding the potential consequences of assigning sovereignty to that vague concept, the people. Poland-Lithuania, however, by creating a Renaissance republic through the institutionalization of the former mixture, took the road less traveled in a Europe in which, after 1648, the concept of the sovereign state gradually emerged as the foundation of the international states system. That decision had consequences, because the philosophy of the former mixture said much about how power was to be shared and limited, but offered little guidance as to how it was to be exercised. That, however, is another story for another day.
Robert, thank you very much. That was an absolutely fascinating lecture. And I can see some questions are coming into the chat, so why don't we just move straight over to them now?
Sure.
Our first question is from Paul Booth. He says, when I was a schoolboy in the 1960s, The state was known in English as the Polish-Lithuanian Republic. Now the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth seems to be favoured. Is there a particular reason for this?
Well, I think the reason is to do with what I was talking about, that Commonwealth is the way in which in 17th century British Isles res publica was translated. And that has enabled, I think, the discussion to move away from the problem I was discussing as to what extent was the Commonwealth a republic. I mean, the republic meant the community of citizens. Baudin's great work itself was called Six livres de la République, 6 books of the Republic, although he was advocating absolute monarchy and hated the mixed form of government. And I think the use, I'm deliberately calling it the Polish-Lithuanian Republic because that is how they conceived it, but it was a particular kind of republic. It was a Renaissance republic and not a modern republic, the system that Machiavelli talked about, a system without a king, which was fine in certain of the city republics of northern Italy that Machiavelli knew so well. But this was a territorial state, a territorial union, indeed, of 2 states. And that's what made the republic such an ideal solution. And I think by using the English term Commonwealth, although when I write about it, I do say the Commonwealth of Poland-Lithuania, because it is established. But at other points, I will call it the Republic because they conceived of it as a republic.
Great, thank you ever so much. So next we have Duncan Hardy. He asks, you've clearly shown that the Polish-Lithuanian nobility saw themselves as the citizenry of a republic. Is there any evidence that non-noble common people believe that this status should apply to them too, and that they should have some agency in electing a monarch?
There was, and in fact, the major cities of Poland-Lithuania had, before 1569, before 1572, had participated in elections of the republics, and certain of them still were. The cities of Vilnius, Krakow, and Lwów, if I remember correctly, were granted effectively corporate noble status, and they did send their representatives to royal elections. The same, effectively in 1572, there was some nobles who basically wanted to give the great cities, some of the royal boroughs at least, rights of participation in the system. But this was a Schlachter republic, except for Royal Prussia, because in Royal Prussia, the Landtag, the Sejmik, was bicameral itself, and representatives of the 3 major Prussian cities, Danzig, Thorn, and Elbing, sat in the Senate of the Prussian Landtag. And until 1662, when they were removed, representatives of the lesser Royal Prussian cities turned up for the lower house. So there was some urban representation within the system. But overall, there was a sort of decision by many of the royal boroughs in around 1572 that in fact they would much rather stay out of the system that was dominated by the Schlachter and rule themselves. And they all adopted this language of citizenship, this language of republicanism, and they were allowed to. An older historiography talked about how Polish-Lithuanian cities were terrible, the Schlachter oppressed them, and so on and so forth. But there's been a great deal of study in recent years of private cities, and private cities were set up by their owners and given rights under Magdeburg law, and in many respects, subject to agreement of their owner, they ruled themselves. This was, in effect, a state of estates, if you want to use the German concept, in which the cities stayed out of the system and ruled themselves. And the same was an open body. Anybody could go along and listen to debates, not like England, where you weren't allowed to say what was said in Parliament, or certainly not printed. And so larger cities would send their observers to the Sejm, who would listen to the debates and lobby their local nobles to say, well, if you agree to this, this will wreck our trade, so you better stop it. So yes, citizenship was certainly felt among the urban classes, at least. It's a different matter with the broader rural population, the peasantry. But then when English burghers and squires talked about the people, I'm not sure that they thought that their agricultural laborers were really part of that people. Or perhaps I'm wrong. Some of them did.
Brilliant, thank you, amazing. I'm going to group some questions coming in, and I want to make sure we get through most of them. I'm going to group a couple together now. We've got Paulina Hughes who's saying, thank you, Robert. Could you perhaps comment on how far religious differences between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the kingdoms of the British Isles determined the different constitutional and conceptual routes that the two took? I'm also going to roll in a question 2 down. In France, religious differences led to civil war and then to absolute monarchy. Why was the outcome so different in Poland?
Well, I think it's because of the institutional structure I've been describing, and because of elective monarchy, which is firmly instituted finally in 1572. And because of the union, the political union, to take the second question as it were first, because of the union, because to keep the union together, the parliamentary structure was the only way to do that in the long run. And so when the opportunity came up in 1572 to create this Renaissance Republic, there appeared a consensus remarkably quickly. I mean, the interregna, the first interregna, were turbulent. There's no doubt about it. You know, noble magnates turned up with large armed retinues and camped where the Schlachter were gathering to vote and to discuss things. But it never spilled over into civil war, except briefly in 1587, and that was very short. And so they had an institutional structure that, as I say, fitted this idea of the mixed form of government. France had I now get into French history, which I've not particularly boned up on for this lecture, but France had, of course, a tradition of which Baudin was in fact part. He thought that, you know, if you read your Baudin, Baudin argues that the king is not subject to positive law that's made by man. He's absolute and above that, but he is subject to natural law. I mean, Baudin was a parlementaire, and Baudin believed that the parlements played a part in deciding what the law was in France. And the French monarchy, while it claimed to be absolute, had to take account of the parlements and the provincial estates, if not the Estates General after 1614. So all of these bodies. But of course, the monarchy, as Baudin argues, is the way out of the religious division. Now, in Poland-Lithuania, I'd agree with Paulina that religion is the key difference in many respects that I see between these two political systems. We know that religion becomes this tremendous explosive issue in all the three kingdoms of Charles I during his reign, because of the way that the Reformations happen differently in England, in Scotland, and in Ireland. In Poland-Lithuania, there was talk. I mean, again, Sigismund August, who's, I think, one of the most underappreciated European monarchs. He is a masterly politician in many ways. Sigismund August takes an interest in Lutheran theology. He thinks about the possibilities of creating a national church, and there's some pressure on him. But in the end, in Poland, the Catholic bishops have always been a body of support for the monarchy. And so to get things through, they're an important part of the Senate Council and the Royal Council. And so Sigismund August draws back from the Reformation, but is in favor of toleration. And there is a strong anti-clerical feeling among many Catholic nobles who resent the fact that the clergy, the Catholic clergy, don't contribute enough to sustaining the Republic. And for right down deep into the 17th century, there are discussions about compositio inter status, which basically means the clergy should pay tax to the Republic. And so that's, I mean, I said the religion, the Polish Revolution is remarkably secular. It is. Religion is a difficult issue, but it doesn't derail the whole process. Whereas in the British Isles, you can see that it does.
So true. Thank you very much. Sarah Mortimer has asked, thank you so much for a really wonderful comparative lecture. I agree with that. My question is about the way different systems can adapt to the need for change. Renaissance republicanism, it seems to me, often emphasises keeping the existing laws and limiting monarchical discretion. And I wonder how far you think the Polish system was able to respond to challenges like inflation, new military technology, etc. One problem in England, Britain does seem to be to know how to deal with the weaknesses displayed by the defeats of the 1620s.
Well, I think it does up to a point. It does, I would argue that down to 1648, the Republican system copes rather better with the military and political challenges it faces than it is often given credit for. Yes, there were problems. And yes, the rhetoric is about the ways in which monarchs want to become absolute. But I sometimes say that's the equivalent of calling Margaret Thatcher a fascist. It's a political abuse. Monarchs down to 1660, down I would say even further, down to 1697, realized that whether or not they would like to be absolute, they have to govern within the system. They have to govern as Republican monarchs, and many of them become rather good. Sigismund III, John Casimir after him, at working this parliamentary system. They know what to say to Parliament. They know what buttons to push. They learn in their own way to manage Parliament up to a point within the system. And, you know, if you look at the performance of the Republic down to 1648, it fights wars on all fronts. It defeats the Swedes in the 1610s, doesn't manage so well against them in the 1620s, but they effectively fight Gustav Adolf, the greatest soldier in 17th century Europe, to a standstill in the 1620s when he invades. They defeat the Muscovites and push them back. At one point, they're fighting a war against Muscovy in the northern front, and they are fighting the Ottomans in the south. They push back the Tatar invasions, Crimean Tatars, more or less every year. And they defeat a massive Ottoman army, or they resist a massive Ottoman army in 1620 to 21. Because they're a citizen army, they love Machiavelli and his art of war. They believe that citizens turn out to defend them, and much of their military efforts are organized locally, which makes a great deal of sense in such a vast, uncentralized system. And what goes wrong, is to return to Paulina's question, is religion. It's all very well having the ideal of citizenship, but the Counter-Reformation changes matters. Protestantism diminishes in support, partly through the office holding or the appointments policies of Catholic kings like Sigismund III, although he begins by appointing a lot of Protestants to office. But by the 1640s, in the Ukrainian Palatinates, the southern Palatinates that are transferred to the Kingdom of Poland, have unions with the Kingdom of Poland in 1569 and detach themselves from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Orthodox citizens are beginning to feel themselves to be second-class citizens. If you have an elected local system of courts in which the judges are all Catholics, is an Orthodox noble going to get justice? And that's part of what lies behind the great explosion in 1648. And then the military weakness of the Commonwealth comes out, because the Schlachter will not condone increasingly foreign wars. You know, we learned under Tony Blair that Parliament couldn't stop Her Majesty's government from declaring war. Well, the Poles and Lithuanians pass a law against that in 1611. But that means you have to fight your wars on your own territory. And that destroys the military institutions of the Republic as foreigners invade and camp their armies in Poland, Lithuania, and milk them. Peter the Great discovers that's terrific. His army is paid for by the Lithuanians, essentially.
Thank you, Robert. I'm going to again group a couple of questions together and see how many we can get through. We'll go till 35 minutes past, so hopefully get through most of the questions then. So Tim Ryder Williams says, thanks for the paper. Will you expand on your points about office holding and about urban-rural differences? You cited Collinson, Hindle, Withington and Stewart and noted that Polish urban communities were similar in being self-governing to German urban communities. So how far did Republican ideas percolate down in Polish-Lithuanian society? Might we compare the Polish-Lithuanian nobility, especially the less wealthy ones, to the English and Scottish middling sorts? And I thought I'd put together with that question from Julian Goodacre. Thank you. Could you say a little bit more about where the idea of the three estates fits into your argument? It wasn't a common idea in England before the answer to the 19 propositions, but it was standard in Scotland, although they untidily added a fourth estate to Parliament in 1587?
Some very good questions, right? So, I mean, I think this language of civic humanism and of Renaissance republicanism percolates right down through the system. I mean, they really do believe that the political system is animated from below, that they will form semics and they will vote and they will send representatives, envoys to Warsaw to the Sejm. Even, I mean, there's a whole group of Polish nobles who are captured by the Muscovites in the 17th century wars, and they're sent off to what is now is Kazakhstan. And what do? They immediately sit down and form a sejmik. They're prisoners of war, but this is how you do things. These institutions penetrate. One of the reasons why the Cossack revolt is so damaging is that the Cossacks imbibe these principles of self-government. They have, the Cossack hetmanate is based in many respects on the institutions of the Republic that it fights. They have, their officers are elected by each other, the hetman is elected. It does penetrate right down through the system. You know, a great city like Danzig has a self-governing tradition, and it argues that it is separate from the system. It is, you know, by the 18th century, Gottfried Lengenig is arguing that, you know, Danzig is basically autonomous under royal authority. It has nothing to do with this Schlachter Republic, which is historically nonsense. If you look at the terms of the union treaties with Royal Prussia from 1454 and 1466, they're incorporated in. I shall neatly dodge Julian's question, I think, by saying that in preparing this, I thought about the three estates, but I think you're right, and this is something that I would need to investigate more. As you say, the Scots added this fourth estate. They had the burghers in there. And so I'm interested in Laura Stewart's remark that the language of citizenship doesn't really percolate into that. And I'd like to, you know, as I said, I do not have the expertise on all fronts to investigate, but I think that's something to investigate. Because as Roger Mason points out, Buchanan is very secular. He's frequently grouped with the Calvinist resistance theorists, but he's not. His arguments are secular. That's why, as I said, I understand them, because he's arguing very much the same way as you know, Poles and Lithuanians are arguing. So I'm interested, and I think lordship is a key. I mean, as I say, I think we begin talking in Scotland. I know lordship is vital and important, as Laura says it is, but those ways in which that lordship sort of cuts across people like Buchanan, who are writing about citizenship and citizenship. What do royal boroughs talk and write about in Scotland, the boroughs, or indeed the lesser cities? So I'll throw that one back across the net to you, Julian, and say, tell me about it, because I'd love to know. And whether, you know, the question I would put is, to what extent is there that tradition which is really drowned out by the essentially religious rebellion and the sort of the confessional confederation that Alan McInnes sees in Scotland from the 1630s. So not sure my expertise stretches that far, Julian, but it's something I'd love to investigate more, because I think it is important.
Thank you, Rob. I'm going to scoop up the last few questions and throw them at you as a bunch. So Kate Hollis asks, it seems that the system in Poland was well designed, but considering how important marriages were between monarchs, did Poland lose a chance to create a powerful future by avoiding that route? Another question about how the political system may have led to economic decline and then partition. Could you say something about differing legal systems and how that understood the republics? And Teresa's put down at the bottom, other factors making Poland-Lithuania different is territorial extent, favouring control and administration by local dignitaries, strong Polish-Italian relations, especially regards to political theory. So there's more than you can obviously address there. A few points that you may like to pick up in your closing remarks.
Yeah, how long have I got? Sorry, what were the first? I got to the end of the list when I was thinking about Poles and Italians, and I lost.
Yeah, marriages between monarchs.
Oh yeah, that it turned out was one of the problems of the system. Polish monarchs, Polish-Lithuanian monarchs, were very aware of the fact that the private club of European monarchs were rather sniffy about monarchs who had been elected and were not hereditary. For a while, I mean, Henry of Valois obviously is a proper royal house. Stefan Batory was a Transylvanian prince, but he married Anna Jagiellonka, the sister of Sigismund August. I mean, she was 50 and past childbearing age, which was one of the reasons why he agreed to marry her. But she was a Jagiellon, and the Jagiellon idea continues down the female line, because she was, her sister, Katarzyna, was Queen of Sweden, married to John III. And so their son is elected Sigismund III in 1587. He's brought up speaking Polish, and he's brought up a Catholic, which is interesting in Swedish terms. Poland-Lithuania, to answer the economic question, was far wealthier, far richer, far larger, far more important in European terms than Sweden was in the 1570s, 1580s. But it caused problems for Sigismund, because by law, the king had to agree his marriage with the Senate Council. And Sigismund greatly upset the wider nobility, who were virulently, on the whole, anti-Habsburg. They feared Germans taking over effectively. And they looked at how the Habsburgs had treated the kingdoms of Bohemia and so on, which is quite closely linked to Poland, and a lot was known about it. So Sigismund married successively two Habsburgs, which associated him, two Habsburg sisters, which associated him with the Habsburgs, and was unpopular. But it was difficult to get his children had no status. By law, you weren't allowed to call yourself, a prince or an heir apparent. Sigismund had 5 sons, of which 3 of them ended up in the church, which is tricky. I mean, one of them, the last one, John Casimir, who does become the last Vasa King of Poland, he's unique in European history, because he is a king who was, first of all, a Jesuit, then he was also a cardinal, and he ended up his life after abdicating as abbot of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris. So, where he entered a morganatic marriage, but that's another story. So yeah, it was difficult, because how do you make royal marriages, and how do you, when you have royal marriages, make royal marriages for people, which reduces the pool of people you can elect and creates a problem. They nearly elected John Casimir's brother in 1648, and he was a bishop. So, you don't have the next generation down. So the dynastic issue is a problem. But that's probably gone on too long, and I've forgotten what the other questions were that you lumped together.
You've done amazingly, Robert. Really wide-ranging questions that we've thrown at you, and you seem to have an answer for everything. We are definitely out of time, and it's time to draw this evening to a close. I'd really like to thank you for what has been obviously a fascinating, wide-ranging and really comparative lecture, a real tour de force, and I think very much what the Society had in mind when they instituted the annual Prothero Lecture.